as a professor and researcher at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Professor Koretz has been studying and teaching about assessments, their value and their limitations for decades. And unlike Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos, he is deeply knowledgeable about education and assessment. And unlike Secretary DeVos, he started as a classroom teacher of emotionally disturbed students. I read a number of bios online and thought this sums up pretty well why we are so excited to have him here this evening. This one said, Koretz's work is essential reading for educators interested in the limitations of assessment systems and for policymakers charged with developing and evaluating new approaches for working with data from educational assessments. So with that, I give you.
Thank you.
Okay.
So I'm delighted to be here. I appreciate the invitation to come. Let me first tell you what this book is and why it was written before I get into some of the narrative about what's in it. I was approached by an editor from the University of Chicago Press about 6 years ago. She became the editor of this book, who I had never met. She was in Cambridge and asked if she could visit me. And she said that she thought I had been pulling my punches in writing about high-stakes testing, which really startled me, but was completely true. That's what academics do. You write this very measured, boring prose. And she said they wanted to sign me for a book in which I didn't pull my punches. It took me about 4 years to decide to do it because, again, it's not the kind of thing we do. You don't write with honest adjectives if you're an academic. But I finally decided to do it. And the reason I decided to do it is I got fed up with the pretense. We have had hard evidence accumulating for almost, well, actually not almost, 30 years about the impact of test-based accountability, and I got tired of people pretending that we didn't, and pretending that they were making things better for kids when they were not. So I decided I would write the book, and for that reason, this is going to sound like shameless commerce, but it's not. I'm going to echo Lisa's comment. You should take a book or more and pass them on. I actually won't make any money from it. The way my contract is written, I'd have to sell a lot of books to make any more money. But that's not why I wrote it. I wrote it because I hoped that it would do a little bit to move the needle, and it won't unless people read it, and more importantly, pass it on. It will give you ammunition you need. That's a bad choice of metaphors given Saturday, but it will give you information you need, and you can pass it on to people who have control. I got an email a few days ago from a stranger in Texas who wrote to me to say that a friend of hers had lent her a copy of the book, and after she read it, she bought a copy for every member of her local school board. That made my day. So I urge you to do the same. So let me tell you what the book is. It basically has 3 parts, one of which is extremely brief. One part lays out what we have learned over the past 30 years about the negative effects of test-based accountability. That's fairly long. There is a single chapter that lays out the positive news. There is some. It's very limited. And the last part is suggestions about what we could do instead. And I'm hoping that people will get past the first 2 parts, which I think are really mostly unarguable. The evidence is quite clear. But there's a lot of room to debate about how we can do things better. And I try to make that clear at the end of the book, that I'm not saying I have the recipe that necessarily will work, though I do think there's some principles enumerated in the book that are necessary. But the particular strategies I suggest may not work the way I want. So that's the debate I hope we will have once we get past the first. So let me start with the bad news. So what's the bad news? It's a long list, so I'll do it quickly. The most important, really, in some ways, is absolutely pervasive bad test prep. It's simply everywhere. There are schools where there's almost nothing else at this point. And by bad test prep, what I mean is test prep that is designed to boost scores on the particular test that kids happen to be given. It's not necessarily designed to teach them things. There are some examples of it that do teach, though they're not generally very interesting, but much of it is just gaming. And that is absolutely ubiquitous, and it is particularly pervasive in low-income schools. It's disadvantaged kids who've gotten the worst of this, which I'll come back to. All right, so what are the consequences of this, apart from the fact that kids are bored silly? One consequence is that we have score increases that are grossly inflated. And we've known this. We've had hard evidence of this since 1990. So it's very disturbing to me that people in power in the educational system still deny that this is the case. There aren't a lot of studies, because I can tell you from bitter experience, if you go to a superintendent and say, I'd like access to your data to see if your scores are inflated, they generally don't welcome you. But the studies that have been done are very consistent. It's quite common to find that gains in scores are 3 to 6 times as large as they should be. There are cases of really large gains in scores that have been accompanied by no real increase in learning whatsoever. Right? Both of those, the bad test prep and the inflated test scores, are worse in disadvantaged schools. Sometimes much worse. All right? So the first indication of this, again, is old news. It's really disturbing that the people who run schools are not willing to confront it. The first hard evidence of this was published in the year 2000, which showed that the so-called Texas miracle, the rapid gains in scores that was accompanied by an extraordinarily rapid narrowing of the gap between minority and non-minority students, was bogus. It was just fake. It was just fake. All right, we have newer studies that show basically the same thing. Disadvantaged kids get the worst of this. And I think this bears stressing for 2 reasons, not only because it's bad in its own right, but because the promise of doing things for disadvantaged kids is what allowed No Child Left Behind to be passed. It's the only reason why people like George Miller and Teddy Kennedy signed on to it. And it was a noble goal, but this approach simply has failed in that respect. All right? That's 2 effects. The third is cheating. We don't know how much there is because there are over 13,000 school districts in the United States. There's no way to monitor them all. And some, like Washington, D.C., don't really have the will to monitor it, even when it's clearly right under their noses. But there's been enough reported in the press to make it clear that this is now endemic. A very gifted student I worked with a couple of years ago, who wrote a good chunk of the chapter on cheating in that book, was able to locate not only about a score of cases, well-documented cases of cheating, some of which led to indictments, like Atlanta and El Paso, but another 200 cases where there were signs of likely cheating. And that's just what reaches the news. When you read that chapter, which I urge you to read, one of the things that she made clear was that it was very hard to bring these to light. What she uncovered was that it was usually 1 or 2 stubborn people who, against all odds, managed to get the news out. Right. In El Paso, which is the one that in Texas that resulted in felony indictments, it was one state legislator who didn't believe the district when it said that it had verified that there was no cheating because of stories he'd heard from constituents. He persisted and it came out. So the point of that is there aren't people like that in many districts. So a lot of what goes on just never sees the light of day. So that's 3 bad effects. The fourth is something that students of mine pointed out to me, and I think in some ways it's the worst of them, or at least it's going to be the hardest to fix. It was students in a class that I teach every year. I have a student from this class here tonight. At the end of that class, for about half a dozen years, I've given students a packet of test prep materials. Some are awful, some are acceptable, and I ask them to evaluate them using one criterion. I tell them, don't worry if it's lousy teaching. I don't care about that if it's boring. What I want to know is, if a kid learned what's there, would she leave with a knowledge or a skill that she could use someplace else? If so, no matter how boring it looks, call it good. If the answer is it will help raise scores on this particular test and nothing else, it's bad. And partway through the discussion, the first year I did this, a former Massachusetts teacher interrupted the discussion to say, this will make no sense to many young teachers. And I was really startled. I said, well, why not? And she said, what we're busy classifying as bad test prep is not only what we were told to do, it's what we were explicitly told is good instruction. The whole room erupted. People said, yes, let me tell you about my district. Let me tell you about my school. we have it, and so a couple of years ago, a student from that same class followed that up with a participation in a small seminar where he started looking at the books that are used in teacher training programs. And it's right there. It's recipes for cheating. Well, I'll come back to whether it's cheating, for teaching to the test. So let me come back to whether it's cheating or not. Virtually every time I'm called by somebody in the press about a cheating scandal, I try to tell them something that they will not listen to. What I tell them is they're drawing too stark a line between cheating and all the rest of the bad test prep. And the question I give them is this. There's a lot of test prep that has ambiguous effects. We're not entirely certain whether it's producing only fraudulent gains or partially fraudulent gains or maybe even some real gains. But there's a lot of test prep that can only produce fraudulent gains. That's all it can do. And there are lots of examples. The one I often use is from that same Massachusetts teacher. It's also in a Princeton review book for the MCAS 10th grade tests. When you write a test item on the Pythagorean theorem, you face a problem if you're a test author. Kids are no longer taught, and haven't been for 2 generations, how to calculate square roots. So they can't solve the problem unless you give them a simple integer solution or a calculator. The solution to this is they always use 3, 4, 5, or a multiple of 3, 4, 5, or 5, 12, 13. So Princeton Review says just memorize those triples. Right? If a kid passes that, gets that item correct because of learning that, she does not know the Pythagorean theorem. And the way I put it in the book is you'd better not hire her to build you a roof. Right? So the question I have for the reporters is, isn't that cheating? If you're engaging in test prep that can only produce fraudulent gains, isn't that cheating? And if that's cheating, don't stop with Atlanta, because it is everywhere. And it's open, it's sold publicly with no reservations. There are states that actually provide this to their teachers. I found this in the Princeton Review following links on a website the Massachusetts Department of Education used to have up. For a few months before the MCAS was fielded, they had a website that a commercial company put up for them with links for useful test prep materials. So I thought, I teach this stuff, I ought to follow this and see where it leads me. And that's where it led me, to Pythagorean triples. Right, so it's not covert. So if you draw the line at where things can produce only fraudulent gains, then there's a huge amount of cheating, and it's very open. All right, the last thing on my list is stress. I suspect I don't have to tell many of you about this. It's an enormous amount of stress on teachers. It's an enormous amount of stress on kids. There are states now, I think Ohio is one of them, that include in their test administration manuals instructions about what you do when the kids throw up on their test forms. So that's the bad news. But to be fair, you have to evaluate, all policies have both good and bad effects. That's the bad, we should look at the good. So what's the good? What has this accomplished? Well, math scores have gone up. And there is, I think, persuasive evidence that actual achievement in mathematics has gone up. But there are a couple of flies in the ointment. The first is that the gains don't seem to last. They're very big in 4th grade. In fact, it's one of the fastest trends up or down I've ever seen in uncorrupted data. It's in the national assessment. But they don't seem to last till kids get out of school. We have only 2 trustworthy indicators of mathematics performance at the end of high school or near the end of high school. Neither one shows any improvement. So you have to wonder what happened to these gains. The second fly in the ointment is the test that people use for this is anomalously positive. There are 3 trustworthy indicators of elementary school math trends. The one that everyone uses, the main national assessment, has the largest gains. But the third fly in the ointment, which is really troubling to me, is we have had data since 1988 that one of the things teachers do when faced with high-stakes testing is take time from everything else. This is not news to, I'm sure, anyone here. Take time out of music, out of art, out of history, out of civics, out of recess. Anybody who thinks you can take time out of recess hasn't taught elementary school. Yeah. All of that time is put into the tests that are the subjects that are tested. One former advisee of mine who taught in Texas, who I by chance ran into in Providence, Rhode Island last weekend, said that in her school, everything had become math and reading test prep. You could go to science labs and there were math test prep. Test prep was everywhere. All right, so some of the gains in mathematics aren't improved instruction. They're just instruction stolen from other topics, other subjects. So yes, there is some good news in mathematics. It's nowhere nearly as good news as advocates of test-based accountability would suggest. In reading, which is of course the other major focus of test-based accountability, it's pretty much nothing. Little bits of movement, but there are no major gains, despite 20 years of this. And it goes back before No Child Left Behind. And then, perhaps the most troubling in some ways is, this is argued a lot in the academic world. My reading of the evidence is it has done essentially nothing to improve equity. Essentially nothing. People will point to the fact that there is the gap between minority kids and majority kids is closing slowly and erratically. That's absolutely true. Data showing that go back to 1964. That's not from No Child Left Behind. Right. At the same time that's been happening, the gap between rich and poor kids has been growing rapidly. And there is simply no evidence that, well, there's one arguable study, let me put it that way, that suggests that kids at the bottom have been helped relative to kids higher up in the distribution of performance. If you look at the data more holistically, I don't see it. I don't see it. So we simply have a failure to improve, to meet one of the major goals of the reforms, which is to improve equity. So the logical thing to do is to say, well, let's compare the bad to the good. And it seems to me the answer is crystal clear. This has failed. It's failed badly. It has done a lot of harm to kids. It's done a lot of harm to teachers. And it's done a lot of harm to teaching as a profession. So in my view, the answer is quite simple. It's time to look for something else. There's plenty of room to argue about what we should do differently, but it makes no sense to me to continue doing something that we have seen now for essentially 30 years has failed. You know, it's the people who insist that we have to do it because we still have problems are sort of analogous to someone who has a chronic illness and goes to a doctor and gets a medication prescribed and finds that he has really severe side effects. It's not helping and it's causing real problems. You wouldn't go back to the doctor and say, well, I still have the illness, so I still want to take this medicine that's making me sicker. You'd do something different. And so it's time, I think, to do something different. Well, I have at the end of the book 2 chapters about what I think we ought to do. But if I have time, I'd like to tell an anecdote about one of them. All right, so early in Arnie Duncan's tenure, very early, in his first months, a colleague of mine was asked to put together meetings for him on different topics, and she asked me to come to the one on accountability. And I didn't recall using this phrase, but I must have used it often because at one point one of his staffers said to me with really evident annoyance in his voice, "What do you mean when you keep talking about all this other important stuff that we should be worried about?" So I told him a story which is now, with the permission of the teacher involved in the book. She was a teacher in the school that my kids went to in Montgomery County, Maryland. My son had a very unsuccessful 3rd grade, so I told the principal I was going to observe all the 4th grade classes before he was placed, which you do not do in that district. But he got tired of me and let me do it. And I always observed, among other things, math, because math is very hard to teach well, and it often isn't. So I went into one of these classrooms, and within a few minutes she began her math lesson. And I was just, by the end, in awe. I taught 4th grade, so I knew what I was looking for. She had, before every single math class, something she called math log. Math log was about a 15-minute period. Kids would get one problem as a group, and they could work together on trying to solve the problem, but they had to write their own logs, and their logs were graded, but not for correctness, because she didn't want them to be worried about making mistakes. They were graded for logic and completeness. So the day I walked into class the first time, she said, all right, it's time for math. She said, it's time for math log, and the kids got excited. Right away I thought, whoa, they're excited about math class. So they gathered around and she said, here's your problem for today. Which is stronger, a rectangle or a triangle? And there was a hubbub around the room. Hands started going up. Miss Padilla, what do you mean by stronger? I thought, wow, this is wonderful. So she said, great, there are lots of ways you could define it. Here's how I'm going to define it for today. Let's say I gave you weights and you piled them on top of a triangle and a rectangle. Which would last longer before it collapsed? Which could hold more weight? That's what I want you to call stronger. They all went to work. Pretty soon they had their answers. They're mostly wrong. They mostly said the rectangles were stronger. So she said, okay, I want you to play with these. And she passed out rectangles and triangles that were made of strips of cardboard held with clips in the corners. And there was an enormous amount of hubbub in the room. And then she said, okay, who was wrong? And they were waving their hands to show that they were wrong. And then she said, this was the coup de grace, she said, all right, who would like to try to explain their mistake? And the room went silent for a while, and then tentatively kids started raising their hands to try to explain their mistake. I was just in awe. And I went home and I called the principal and I said, my son goes in Norca Padilla's class. And he said, you don't get to choose this. I said, my son goes in Norca Padilla's class. And eventually he got tired of me. And my son went to Norca Padilla's class, and it was like that all year. 3 years later, I called him and said, guess what? My daughter goes in Norca Padilla's class. So when I asked Arnie Duncan, I said, can you tell me that what you are about to propose on schools will encourage that kind of teaching, which is the best fourth grade math teaching I have seen in my entire career? Silence, though. I said, all right, can you at least promise me that you're not going to do something to discourage that kind of teaching? Well, the answer was he was going to discourage that kind of teaching. You'd have to be nuts to do that kind of teaching if your well-being depends on a high value-added score on one math test. It's not an efficient way to raise scores. All right, so that's an example of the other important stuff, which is my first principle. You don't hold people accountable until you can agree on what you want to see walking in a classroom door. And I want to see things like engagement. I want to see kids motivated. I want to see them enjoying learning. I want to see a lot of things that I want teachers to be encouraged to do. And you have to encourage people, if you're going to hold them accountable, to do the things you really want to see. So that's the first step. We have to step back and say, what do we really want to see in a classroom? The logic, logic is the wrong word. The premise behind No Child Left Behind was you can hold people accountable for a couple of things and everything else will follow along. That's utter nonsense, and we have more than 30 years worth of research in many fields that shows that that approach to accountability doesn't work. If you hold a few people accountable for just a few things, the other things happen less, which is exactly what we've seen. All right, so we have to argue about what we really want to see, and we want to make that important stuff count, and we want to give teachers support for doing it. Most teachers don't know how to do what that teacher was doing. I didn't know how to do it when I taught fourth grade. So someone has to teach people how to do that, right? We need to set reachable targets. The targets that have been set in No Child Left Behind and in many of the state programs that preceded it are absolutely arbitrary. It's not as though people say, well, we've looked at classrooms like this and the best of them can make gains this big, and so that's what we'll ask people to do. They set standards by methods that I don't think are very sensible anyway, but that have nothing to do with how much improvement people can make. They then pick an arbitrary amount of time and say, get there. Well, what are people going to do if you set targets that they can't reach by legitimate means? Really no-brainer, right? I mean, it was literally over 30 years ago, I think 31 years ago, that I wrote something which I said there are going to be 3 possible outcomes. People will cut corners, they'll fail, or they'll cheat. And the answer is they did all. All right, so set reasonable targets. Another example I often use is I taught remedial reading when I was an elementary school teacher. I had kids who were severely dyslexic who were in 5th and 6th grade and were probably, it's a long, distant memory, probably about the 2nd grade level. So if I'd been a really good teacher of remedial reading, I was a lousy teacher of remedial reading, but had I been a good one, I might have been able to get them to the 3rd grade level, or maybe, if I was really, really good, to the 4th grade level. That, in today's system, would make me a failure, because the goals aren't set with respect to what I could do given the context that I was in. All right, the third, which is sort of obvious, Linda Darling Hammond many years ago characterized test-based accountability as kicking the dog harder. Right? The notion is teachers somehow know how to do what we want. If we just, they'll do it. Well, many of them don't know how to do what we want them to do, and so we need to provide supports, we need to provide better training, we need to provide the ability to watch other people's classes, we need to provide a lot of support, and some of that's expensive. Third, we need to pay attention to context. Not all schools with low scores are bad, not all schools with high scores are good. The schools my kids went to were the highest achieving school cluster in the state of Maryland. You could have locked those kids in the basement all day. It wouldn't have mattered. Because what they didn't learn at school, their parents either taught them themselves or they hired tutors. I mean, I was the go-to reteach the math guy among my son's circle of friends. And other people had, went to other people for help. So the high scores in that school didn't tell you whether the school was good. Some of the teachers were actually very, very good. Some were awful, and you couldn't tell from the scores. Likewise, there's some schools that have low scores, assuming we don't have bad score inflation, because the teachers aren't doing a good job. There's some that have low scores because, for example, the kids are so transient that they don't have time to work with them. So the logical thing to do is use scores as a way to decide where you have to look further. This is what's done in the Netherlands, by the way, where they do a lot of testing, lower stakes testing. They have a national inspectorate, and they spend a disproportionate amount of their inspection time on schools that are seen from other indicators to be troubled, to find out what the problems are. Another, I think, it's a very controversial principle. I don't think we can do better without going back to relying on human judgment. The reform chamber.
Whoa.
The reason, well, all right, so give credit to the people who created all this stuff. There are reasons why they didn't want to. All right? And one reason is that evaluation systems in public education have traditionally been awful. They've been a joke. They were where I taught. Another is that it's actually very, very hard to use subjective judgment well in a civil service system. This is something I actually didn't think about until about 10 years ago. An economist I've worked with told me I was missing a very important point. In the private sector, if I'm a mid-level person and I've got some of you working for me and I have a grudge against one of you, but you're doing really well, I have an incentive not to punish you because of my grudge, because you're making me money. In a civil service system, that's not true. There are no consequences to the manager for misusing subjective judgment. So we need more checks and balances to do it well. And there are a lot of reasons why it's very, very difficult to do this well. But I don't see any way we can actually evaluate things like the teaching I just described without using human judgment. When you see it, it's obvious, but I can't think of what I would do in the way of standardized measures that would have revealed how outstanding a teacher Norca Padilla was. Last, two more, countervailing incentives. I thought as I was writing this book that I'd had a brilliant thought until I remembered that I had actually read it in the British Economics Journal 12 years earlier. The accountability system we have put together in education is really perverse in a fundamental way. Everybody from the bottom to the top has exactly the same incentive. Raise scores as fast as you can. It's no coincidence that some of the worst cheating scandals have been imposed on teachers by principals. Everybody wants scores to go up as fast as they can, from the lowest level teacher aide to the superintendent of schools. Nobody has an incentive to worry about how you're doing it. Now, there are lots of other cases where that kind of accountability system has been used, but my favorite, this is the thing I thought was a brainstorm of my own, but it isn't, is the Soviet industrial system. That's exactly how the manufacturing sector was run in the Soviet Union, a sector that produced shoes that nobody wanted to buy, because there was a numerical target and everyone had to meet it. And there is actually believe it or not, it's not just anecdotes, there is a scholarly literature on how people cut corners in the Soviet Union. And I don't remember many of them, but one that I do remember, this one is documented, is shoes. It turns out that at one point, the number of shoes produced was the major indicator that determined rewards. But one year, leather became expensive. That's a problem. If you have only so much money to buy leather and you have to produce a lot of shoes, what do you do? And one very clever vacuum manager realized there was a solution: produce only really small shoes. So he met his quota, and all the workers got what they needed, but nobody wanted the shoes. So we need a system where somebody has an incentive to actually watch what you do. Somebody needs to worry about how you are accomplishing what you're accomplishing in schools. When I taught, I had that. My first 2 years of teaching, I worked for one of the best principals I've ever met. He came into my room all the time. Well, I shouldn't say all the time, but at unpredictable intervals, frequently. I actually had, because I taught special ed, a one-way mirror in my room, so he could have just gone into the observation booth and watched me. He didn't. He came in, smiled, sat down, took out a notepad. He knew what was happening in every single group in that school. So if I had been meeting my goals, accomplishing something and meeting my goals, behaving in a way that he didn't want to see, he would know it. That's one of the things that's missing in our system. People believe that if the numbers look good, what's going on in schools must be good, and that simply isn't true. All right, the last thing I'm going to suggest as a principle is that the reform movement in one respect has been remarkably arrogant. So we've now gone through, depending on how you count, maybe 6 different flavors of test-based accountability. If you go back far enough, maybe 7 or 8. And every time the same thing happens. A bunch of people sit around and decide they've figured it out. I've actually been in some of those discussions. They think now they've figured it out. They drop something into schools wholesale. They don't bother pilot testing it beforehand. They just say, all right, all 40 million kids get this. And 6 or 7 years later, you start seeing signs that it's failed. So they do it all over again. Right? I was in when college and career readiness was becoming a buzzword, I was in an Aspen Institute meeting where there were 2 researchers, one private sector entrepreneur, and the rest were education policymakers. And they were going on and on about college and career readiness, and all of a sudden, one of them stopped and he said, you know, I'm not sure we agree on what this means. They didn't actually agree on what this means. So then, later on, one of them was drawing, it's actually somebody from Massachusetts, a big chart about the system he was devising, and the private sector entrepreneur has a very, I know a little bit, has a very strong interest in education, stopped him and said, is there some basis for this, or are you just making it up? And the answer was he was making it up. All right, so we should not do that again. If we're lucky enough to get this machinery to stop and to get an opportunity to replace it, we need to face the fact that we're going to be wrong a good bit of the time. Education is an extraordinarily complex system, and we just aren't always going to get it right. And so what does that mean? That means I think we have to monitor all the time. We have to have formal evaluations of things before we use them wholesale, right? And we have to be prepared to change course. That's politically very costly. It was now 30 years ago that Rick Mills, who was then the commissioner in Vermont, decided he wanted to hold replace standardized test portfolio assessments. And I was one of the perhaps dozen people who was brought into Kibitz about this before they did it. I became their evaluator. But before I was their evaluator, I said to him one day, you know, if anybody tells you that they know how this is going to work out, run the other way. It's like they're selling you a bridge. Nobody knows. You're plowing new ground. We can all speculate. We have some basis for it. We're not just making it up. But the fact is, nobody in this room really knows what's going to happen. So you ought to be prepared for that. And to his credit, he did exactly that. He went around the state saying, we are plowing new ground. We are going to make sure that outsiders independently evaluate what we're doing, and when we make a mistake, we will change course. And he did. The first time we had bad news, we found that the scoring of the portfolios was truly dreadful. So I warned him at a meeting we went to, and he said, I have a couple of requests. One is, can you get me the information by October so it can go out in our reports? I said, yes. He said, second, will you come and address my state board? I said, sure. So I went up to address his state board, and he had forgotten one part of the request. He said, well, the press is across the street. We're going to go there first. So I walked into this room with him, and there were the cameras lined up across the back. It really was, the Vermont press was all lined up. So he gave a very short introduction. He said, the study has shown us systematically that there are problems that we've been hearing from teachers. So from my perspective, the question is, how do we fix this? But in the meantime, this is the person most responsible for the study. Ask them whatever you'd like. That doesn't happen very often. But he made the smart move of essentially building political capital by admitting at the beginning that he was trying new things and that he would have to change if they were wrong. And after that, I did go to brief the state board, and I ended up eating lunch next to the chair of the state board, and she said to me at one point, we have to make sure that he's not punished for being so principled. Now, that's not easy to do in a lot of places, but we need a commitment from the beginning that we're going to consistently, on an ongoing basis, evaluate what we're doing in schools. The real bottom line for this for me is that in addition to doing a lot of damage to teaching and to the teaching profession, this is doing a lot of harm to kids. And it is time, I think, really for all of us to try to bring it to a halt. And to do that, tell the people in control to read the book. I will not make money on it, but get them to read the book. One last thing I'll say about this. I've talked longer than I promised I would. While I was writing a book, a student came in to see me, and he asked what I think is the hardest question of all. He said, look, everybody is connected to this system. Realtors use it to sell houses, people use it to buy their houses, people use it to choose schools, people want high scores because their kids are going to go to college, college want high scores for their kids. Everybody's tied up in this. The politicians depend on it because they promised high scores. He said, where is the entry point? Where's the point of leverage? And I don't think there's an easy answer to that, but I actually think the starting point has to be parents. Because if enough parents say that this is not what they want, the policymakers who control schools are going to have to start to listen. I'll stop there. I talked about